And joining us now, Jeffrey Steiner. He's president of New Franchise Media, which has a number of film and television production projects in the hopper, and it's good to have you here at TVO.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm told I have a face for radio, so when I can do TV, I'm pretty happy.
Well, you're certainly dressed the Hollywood producer today, aren't you?
Well, a little bit.
Because you are, we should just tell everybody right off the top, you are not the traditional Hollywood producer, right? You are a...
Real estate guy.
Well, and even beyond that, you've got background in politics,
Yes.
and you're a Tory backroom guy, right?
A little bit, yeah. I spent a bit of time in the back rooms, serving the public that way, and also for a long time running the Toronto Economic Development Corporation. So it's public service without the politics.
Well, and that's a good place to start, because I gather in that capacity, this thing we now call Pinewood Studios,
Yes.
which is this massive thing on the lakefront that has all these movies made on it, you were part of the mix that brought that here. How did all that come together?
Well, it was identified that a challenge for Toronto at the time, being Hollywood North, the biggest challenge was there wasn't enough soundstage space. We have some great operators who are in the business, Toronto Film Studios, Cinespace, etc., but there weren't enough purpose-built sound stages at the time. And so TEDCO is an economic development corporation for the city, but also is the landowner of a lot of the property on the waterfront, set aside some space to build major infrastructure for the film and television industry. Hollywood wanted to come here because we have great talent, it's an affordable place to do films, but there just wasn't the new purpose-built sound stages or enough of them, and that's really how we got into being a film studio developer, which opened a few years ago and seems to be doing what we expected it to do.
Who actually built the thing?
Well, it was built partly by TEDCO, so the environmental cleanup, some of the foundational work was done and paid for by TEDCO, and then a group called the Rose Corporation, Toronto Film Studios was their operating subsidiary. They won an international competition to be the one to build and operate the studio, and they did what they said they're going to do. They built Canada's largest film studio, which is in Toronto's Portlands.
And your association with that, I guess, turned you on to showbiz.
It took 5 years to get that done. One of the most difficult types of real estate is a film studio because it has no ongoing tenants. You know, films come and go and they use the facility. So even a hotel is an easier financial real estate property to develop than a film studio. And so what they did, the Rose Corporation, Sam Reisman, who's the president, and they own Toronto Film Studios, Ken Ferguson, they decided, they took the risk of building this kind of infrastructure, massive and expensive infrastructure, to be the place that the Toronto's talent could be brought to bear, mostly on Hollywood films. And it seems to have worked because at the beginning, before Filmport, as it was originally called, it's now Toronto Pinewood Studios, but before that, the biggest film in Toronto was about $48 million. X-Men, Chicago, that was about the size of the films that were shot in Toronto. Now, with Filmport, or with the Pinewood Studios, it's $175 million productions. $200 million was the one just wrapped in the studio the other day, Guillermo del Toro's Pacific Rim. So we're now getting $200 million films being shot in Toronto, hiring Toronto people, putting that talent to bear, and a big part of it is the fact there are gorgeous new studios that are tall and purpose-built for that industry.
Now, your movies aren't quite that expensive yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, but let's talk about that. You've set up this company called New Franchise Media.
Yes.
What does that do?
So, New Franchise Media is really two things. It's a rights owner, so I optioned a whole bunch of Jeffrey Archer's novels.
Seen here.
Seen right here. The right to make them into film, to make them into television series, to make them interactive on the internet and streaming. So, so we option those rights. So we're rights owners, intellectual property owners, and also producers. But because we're first-time producers, and I personally have never made a film before, but some of my colleagues that are part of New Franchise, our vice presidents and others, have. But since we're new at it, we said, you know, we're going to have to partner with established, experienced producers. And so that's what we did, and we have some fantastic partners.
You got Frank Marshall.
Frank Marshall.
Frank Marshall's
yes.
made 100 movies.
He has, The Born Identity.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, all those pictures. Yeah. That's him.
And he's a fine man, one of the nicest people I've ever met anywhere in the world.
How'd
Just
you get
happens
him?
to be Hollywood. Well, we put a list together of action producers. So half of Jeffrey Archer's books are espionage, action, crime stories. The other half are family sagas like Cain and Abel and more dramas. So for the actions, we made a short list of who are the best action producers. Frank Marshall was right at the top. Gail Ann Hurd, who does the Terminator series and Aliens, she was right up there. So we reached out kind of to those top 3 or 4, met with them down in Los Angeles.
Okay, wait, met with them in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Why would he take a meeting from a guy he's never heard of?
Well, partly Jeffrey Archer is one of the top 10 authors in the world. So his book, that brand, that idea is very, very strong. And that's what I saw when I went to see Jeffrey to option his books. I saw this incredibly untapped asset, which are these fantastic stories written by a great author who has a worldwide audience, huge audience, over 100 million, 300 million books sold. And so that sounded pretty good to me, and it sounded pretty good to Frank.
Let's again do a little background here. Jeffrey Archer, former Conservative Member of Parliament in Great Britain.
Yes.
How do you know him?
So when he was a politician, he was Margaret Thatcher's party president, essentially, for the UK Conservative Party. He was an MP. But because he wasn't a cabinet minister, he could still do his writing career. So he kept writing his books. And every once in a while, he'd come to Toronto, do a New York and Toronto to cover North America for a book launch, like your book launch for your book.
I got a feeling they weren't like mine. But
well,
anyway,
they might have been a little different, but they're both great
Yeah.
literature. And so when he did Toronto, I called him up to come and speak at the Albany Club. And he said, yes, I'll do that. During the day, I have to do media. I have to go to bookstores, but after 3 or 4 o'clock, I'm free. So we did a reception. He came there. He was really funny. It was a great event. So I struck up a bit of a friendship with him. That's about 18, 20 years ago. And almost every time he had a book, we'd invite him back, and he'd do the same kind of thing. Part of an international speaker series sometime. You may remember years ago, you did Steve Forbes. You did an interview with him.
I remember that well,
Well, he was one of the speakers in this series, and so was Jeffrey Archer as kind of an international fellow. So we became friends, and after the 5 years of getting that film studio built in the waterfront, I said to myself, you know, how can I capitalize on this? It's not like I'm going to build another film studio, because they only happen every 50 years. And I remembered that, you know, Jeffrey's books, there was some mini-series, a few of them, but he's never had one of his books on the silver screen. There's never been a big movie. So when I was in London, I had breakfast with him, and I said exactly that. Jeffrey, your work is fantastic. You've had some mini-series. Why has there never been a major motion picture?
Okay, I have no clue about this, so, and I don't know if you can tell me, but I'm going to ask anyway. When you make a deal to say, I want to option that book and potentially turn it into a movie, you have to give him money to do that.
I have to give him some money.
How much money do you have to give him to do that?
I can't say exactly, but it was a good amount of money. But because he was a friend of mine, he worked with me, actually. He and I teamed up to go after his agent and come up with a good deal. And so I gave him some money for the option payment. He makes much more money when a film is actually made. But the option payment, I paid for.
Is it a six-figure deal?
It works out that way, yes, but it's multiple books. And what he did for me that I think he probably wouldn't have done for anybody else is my option runs for many, many years. So I have the time to develop these properties. I had the time and the luxury to go and find Frank Marshall as a partner. And Gaylan Hurd on a TV show, I mentioned her earlier, she's doing an action TV show with us on another book. That took about a year.
And how many books have you optioned?
I've optioned 10, and I'm about to option maybe 5 more. His latest book's called The Clifton Chronicles.
So this is a bit of a risk on your part. If he's not popular on the silver screen, you've just blown a lot of money.
Well, if you don't have any return if you don't take a little bit of risk. But I mitigated that risk a bit, Steve, by talking to some friends in Toronto who are in the business. And so Diane Schwam, she is my vice president now. She works with me on this. She was 25 years with Warner Brothers. So that took care of a little risk. The former head of the Ontario Film Development Corporation from a few years ago, Gail Thompson, she's working with us. So I'm getting advice from experienced people who are helping me. And I took 4 months before I made the offer to Archer's agent to learn more about the business. So building a film studio, that's one thing. Making a film, that's completely different.
And are you at the point yet where you know how much it will cost to bring one of these books to the screen?
By and large, and it'll be different costs. Television is much more affordable. It's probably a couple $1 million an episode. A major motion picture, that's in the 60 to 80 million zone, and that means Hollywood, and that's why I had to go down there to do the deal, to do the business of film is done in Hollywood. Making great productions. Canada, whether it's Vancouver and particularly Toronto, are really second to none in the world of places to make films.
But not to make the deal.
To make the deals on the big films, to my surprise, I've learned in the business, it's really Los Angeles, New York to a certain extent, if you're talking over $20 million films. And most of Canadian films are lower budget. Still fantastic, but just lower budget.
Right. Now, Marshall's your creative guy, right? So you need a money guy down there.
Yes.
Who's your money guy?
So the money guy starts with the studio. And so the sequence, you sort of asked how you move along the chain. So I've optioned the material. I get a producing partner who really knows what he's doing and has juice, so to speak, or heat, as they say in Hollywood. But the next step is a script. So you can't figure out the budget of a film. You can't talk to financiers until you know how much that film is going to cost. And the book is not the building block of a great film, the script is.
Have you got a script yet?
And so I have scripts being written. That's kind of the expensive part. You sort of asked how much money you had to spend. One big check is to Jeffrey Archer, but it's in stages. The next big check is actually to a screenwriter. That can be $200,000 to get a great script.
And who's your screenwriter?
Well, so I got a guy out of New York named Richard Regan who's doing the script. The book is called A Matter of Honor. It's a great espionage story. So he's writing that script. We hope that will be the first movie of 3 or 4 movies, kind of built on the Bourne Identity style of the business plan. And then I've got a great Canadian named Brian Young out of Victoria who's working on another book, another script called False Impression, which is an action crime caper book. So you got to keep a couple of these things moving along at the same time. You never know which one is going to hit first.
Well, and that's my next question. How long does it take to write a script?
A script, at least 12 to 14 weeks for the first draft, and then it's another 4 or 5 weeks. So in the summer, Frank and I will sit down, Diane Schwam on my team, he's got a vice president of development down in Hollywood. The 4 of us will get together with the writer, read through his script, say, is this good enough, or do we want to change anything? Finalize the script, and then we take it to a studio. The first studio we have to take it to, because Frank Marshall is connected with the studio, happily, is Steven Spielberg's studio, which is called DreamWorks. So if all goes well, we'll have a DreamWorks production. If DreamWorks doesn't want to do it for a variety of reasons, we'll auction it off to Universal or Warner Brothers or Sony. So that's a lot of the fun of the business.
But I look at you, and there is absolutely no doubt in your eyes that this is going to get done.
Yeah, it starts with a great story, and you have to be optimistic. And people told me, we talked about the film studio in the Portlands, people told me, firstly, you can't get anything done on Toronto's waterfront. And then secondly, the last thing you're going to be able to do is get a film studio done. And our team, with a lot of support from the counselors and the local community, the film community, we got that film studio done. It was nearly impossible. So I have to believe that these kind of things are possible. And it starts with fantastic stories written by Jeffrey Archer. And so when you have a great story, something good is going to come out of it.
Now tell me this, because we just had the head of the OMDC on before you. They offer all sorts of tax breaks and special programs to encourage people to make movies here. How much of that do you tap into to get this stuff done?
It's really important. Ontario, in particular, has a great program of these production incentives, essentially, and a lot of other jurisdictions, too. Ontario's is not the highest, but what we have in Ontario, and Toronto in particular, is this incredible skill set of the people involved. You know, why? It's partly TVO, Toronto is a media center, CBC is here. So we have really great skilled people, whether they're carpenters or people doing sound and camera operation, and Hollywood wants that. When you add to that an incentive program like the Ontario production incentives, it just makes Toronto the great place to do this work.
If we didn't have these incentives in place, would you have made the movie somewhere else?
You know, probably, but I built into my contracts, the ones with Frank and the ones with Gail Ann Hurd on the TV show, that we're going to shoot them in Toronto.
So that's part of the deal.
And we're going to find Canadian talent, whether it's on-screen talent. We're going to be looking for a leading man in A Matter of Honor.
I'm sorry, I'm busy that day.
Okay,
so,
you're busy
yeah.
that day. But we'll be looking for directors of photography, writers, others who can be part of this team, but it's still geared. This product, what we're going to make, these movies and TV shows, are going to be geared for the worldwide commercial audience. So we might not have, a Little House on the Prairie in our movie, but we will have great entertainment, and there'll be a lot of Canadians involved, and we'll shoot it right here in Toronto.
Now, Jeffrey, when we watch this movie and the credits roll at the end, what's going to be beside your name?
Well, I will follow the credit after Frank Marshall. So it'll be produced by Frank Marshall, and then my name will show up. And then as executive producers, a couple of my team will show up, Mark Romoff and Diane Schwam. And,
so you're going to be your producer.
I'm a producer. In fact, Frank, just going back to how great this man Frank Marshall is, when we sat down, I said, you'll be the producer, I'll be an executive producer. That's a slightly lower title than produced by. And he said, no, actually, Jeff, you're the one who optioned the books. You're the one who decided to connect a couple books so that we have a multiple film thing. You're a producer. I insist, this is Frank Marshall saying, I insist you have the producer title too. And in fact, I'm going to get a piece of his producing fee, which really comes from the studio financing of the film.
Now, how much say will you have in, I mean, you obviously had a huge say in who writes the scripts,
Right.
but how about casting and, choice of music and, every 1,000 decisions that have to be made on a movie?
Well, again, I'm relatively new to the business, and just like in any other endeavor, it's a team effort. So I think I'm going to defer a little bit to Frank Marshall's view. As you said, he's made over 100 movies, and almost all of his movies have been hits, and many of them are multi-film franchises like Raiders or Back to the Future, and Bourne Identity certainly. So it will be a lot of deferring to that experience. At the end of the day, the truth of the matter is I actually have all of the rights because I own the material, but I'm going to exercise those rights judiciously because I want a film made, and once we get one going, the rest of the Archer properties will take off.
But you do get the final word.
Yes,
is that right?
Yes. Until the studio is involved and finances the film,
and then they get the final word.
And then they get the final word, and then there's something called Hollywood studio accounting. And maybe I'll have to come back in a year and try to tell you about that, but I can probably never understand that. Nobody in Hollywood understands that.
And nor do I, but I'm guessing it's something like, do you want your money up front in a fee, or do you want to take points or a percentage? And have you thought that through?
I have, and I'm getting a lot of advice saying, take the money as a fee, don't worry about the back end. And maybe on the first film, the one I'm doing with Frank Marshall, because that is a big studio production, that'll be 60, 70, 80, $100 million. We don't know until the script is done. But on that one, the studio brings so much power in marketing that will push the Archer brand very strong. And if I don't make a lot of money on that film, but it gets the Archer name out there, like Grisham, and Harry Potter and all of those as a top brand, then I'll benefit because I have the other 9 to 14 books. I don't intend to be ripped off. I have some great Los Angeles and Toronto lawyers.
It is Hollywood, after all.
I get advice. Yeah. Yesterday I spent 2 hours with Peter Sussman. He used to be a big part of Alliance Atlantis. He's the one who did the CSI deal. He was giving me all kinds of great business advice, not just creative advice, but business advice. So I'm listening, I'm learning, I'm going to be careful, but I'm optimistic.
Jeffrey, good for you, and we really look forward to seeing this picture up on the silver screen.
We'll have a great party here in Toronto when we finish shooting.
I bet you will. Jeffrey Steiner, President, New Franchise Media. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.